We are very pleased that you took this long journey from Boston to Mainz to let us benefit from your current research on world literature. Thank you very much for being here today, Professor Damrosch. Let me shortly introduce one of the internationally most renowned comparatists. Actually, it is due to Tristram Shandy that the teenager David Damrosch became a comparatist because he found references to Cervantes and Rabelais and fell in love with a broader panorama of literature. Now David Damrosch chairs the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, Professor Damrosch taught at Columbia University. He received his BA and PhD from Yale University. According to the New York Times, Professor Damrosch is an eloquent champion of world literature. He is the author of What is World Literature? And How to Read World Literature. Furthermore, he is founding general editor of the 6-volume Longman Anthology of World Literature, editor of Teaching World Literature, and co-editor of the Princeton Sourcebook in Comparative Literature. This one. For David Damrosch, reading world literature means reading across time and cultures, reading translated works well, and exploring today's global perspective. His research focuses not only on a wide choice of genres, but also on writers of different times, nationalities, and cultures all over the world, from the loss and rediscovery of the great epic of Gilgamesh to 20th century Latin American poet Alejandra Pizarnik. Because after all, as David Damrosch writes in How to Read World Literature, it takes a world to write a book on world literature. His current research projects include a book on the discipline of comparative literature and a book on the role of global scripts in the formation of national literatures. We are looking forward to these publications. David Damrosch got in touch with Middle High German, Old Norse, and Aztec, finding that once he fell in love with the literature, he tended to want to learn more about the language. As a perfect comparatist, he has studied 12 languages so far. Moreover, Professor Damrosch is the founding director of the Institute for World Literature. Its aim is to explore the study of literature in a globalizing world, while also giving everyone opportunities to share their current research and exchange ideas for future projects, and to build up a network of friendships to support future contacts and collaborations. In location from Beijing to Istanbul to Harvard and beyond, the Institute is global in its presence as well as in its intentions. The next session will take place at Harvard this summer, where we should take this project as a role model. David Damrosch is also advisor to the multimedia series Invitation to World Literature, which offers an online passport to a rich heritage via 13 works from a range of eras, places, cultures, languages, and traditions. Professor Damrosch is a past president of the American Comparative Literature Association and directed its 2009 annual meeting. As we already know, another field of Damrosch's research is translation. For him, world literature is writing that gains in translation. But also Damrosch's own works have been translated into an eclectic series of languages, including Chinese, Estonian, Vietnamese, and Turkish. Today, Professor Damrosch will talk about the shifting grounds of comparison, and that is what we are waiting for. So please join me in welcoming David Damrosch.
Vielen Dank, Martin, für diese sehr freundliche Einladung. Ich glaube, dass ich spreche etwas fließender auf Englisch als auf Deutsch. Obwohl mein Ansatzpunkt ist einige Dinge von Christian Moser in seinem Buch Die Idee der Weltliteratur, die ich habe hier, Sie haben diese, wo er sagt, die alternative Weltliteratur oder Nationalliteratur existiert nicht. Weltliteratur ist immer auch Nationalliteratur. Weltliteratur ist keine Literatur für sich. Sie existiert nicht neben oder über die nationalen Literaturen, sondern in ihnen, auch dann, wenn sie zwischen ihnen vermittelt. I think this is a very important point that I'd like to develop a bit, but I thought I would begin first. So the question is comparison and also literature, and picking up on Christian Moses' point on the problem of Geschichtsvergessenheit. That seems to me an increasing problem in the world today, auch für Komparatisten. Seems to me that so much discussion of literary studies and globalization focuses on works written in the last 50 years, that is to say the most recent 1% in the history of literary production. Or even if we go back to the Goethe site, we're talking about 200 years, the most recent 4% of the history of literary production. And even with globalization, among other things, brings us an absolute unprecedented range of earlier material from around the world. And this is an important feature of the study of literature today. And I think not only then, so two things really. It really makes us ask not only what is comparison, what is the role of Komparatistik, but what is also literatur. You know, there's a lot of discussion of Wissenschaft, Komparatistik, but the term in the middle is equally problematic. Was ist denn Literatur? Actually, my book, I must confess, on what is world literature. And the title came to me after I signed a contract to do the anthology of world literature I did for Longman. And actually, the original title was really, what the fuck is literature? It's world literature, but I decided for Princeton a slightly shorter title would be more appropriate for that elegant press to do. But what is then literature? So I had this little handout. I think I'll start with this. If you look on the page with Heine, and actually Martina mentioned Pisarnik, and that so happens, considering I have Pisarnik also, as you will see. And so the concept of literature itself, as we use it very broadly, sort of arose, you know, in France and Germany in the late 18th century, early 19th century, when literature and literatur start to have the modern sense of aesthetic writings separated out from a much broader range of humane letters, what it had meant before. And so I think, you know, so the problem is both when we go forward from, say, the kind of understanding that you could see in the Heine poem that I give you, towards things written far beyond in terms of more recent and outside the European sphere, like the Pisarnik poem, or far beyond historically earlier, as in the Sanskrit passage on the back page, then we have to ask, do we know what literature is, or how do we even formulate that, which is also one of Christian Moses' really points about the method and the object of comparison, what should it be. So just to look at this, I thought I'd just, after these very wide-ranging first two talks, maybe a couple of examples might be of interest. And I'm very much myself very text-immanent. I'm always happier if I have some literary text to begin from. And so I was thinking, you know, this first comparison of the Heine and the Pisarnik, we can almost ask, you know, do they understand themselves as playing the same game at all? Would Heine recognize Pisarnik's lyric as a poem? You know, it does not have so much that he understands. So just this little example of ein Fichtenbaum steht einsam im Norden nach Kauderhöhe, ihn schläfert mit weißer Decke und Bühlen in Eis und Schnee. Träumt von einer Palme, die fernen Morgenland, einsam und schweigend trauert auf einer der Felsenwand. You know, think of all the things it has. It's beautiful, ironic, short lyric, that Pisarnik doesn't have, right? Novo poema de tua sensia, solo un dibujo, un grieto nel muro, algo nel viento, un sabor amargo. But you know it's poetic. But with Heine, no, it's poetic. It does not have meter. It does not have rhyme. It does not have a goddamn verb. Right? If this were not written in 3 separate lines, you might not even know it was not prose. You know, we would not know that. So is it a lyric at all? Is it a poem? You know, are they playing the same game? Is it producing a poetic reverie effect? What is it doing? If we take these, so we see how a kind of a radical disjunction from the European 19th century to the 20th century. This is where Pisarnik committed suicide in the mid-20th century, I guess late 60s, I think. This is by, or around 70. This is from the 60s, this poem. What happens then if we confront this with something really different from outside the European literary system, like the invention of poetry in the Ramayana on the other side of the handout? And this is a wonderful passage, and this is also a passage which confronts us as comparatists with the problem of translation, since having only done a little bit of language study myself, I have not gotten to Sanskrit, which is a matter of continual regret. So I'm reading this only in translation. But even in translation, I think we can observe some features of it. And here we see a very radically different social assumption about what literature is. Almost different in kind from, certainly from Heine. So, and I put these together to kind of Waldszene. So we have the Heine's Fichtenbaum, Beaming of the Palme in the global south. If we now go to the global south, we have a forest scene. And this is a scene in the prologue to the Ramayana, roughly 2000 BCE, 200 BCE, excuse me, 2200 years ago, which represents the invention of poetry by Valmiki, who's supposed to be the author of the Ramayana. So the kind of a mise on the beam where in the poem, Valmiki invents the poem. And he's going to take a bath, on his way to take a ritual bath. Taking the bark from his disciples' hands, he walked about, his senses tightly controlled, looking all about him at the vast forest. Nearby, the holy man saw an inseparable pair of sweet-voiced Karankabers wandering about. But even as he watched, a forest hunter, filled with malice and intent on mischief, struck down the male of the pair. Seeing him struck down and writhing on the ground, his body covered with blood, his mate uttered a piteous cry. And the pious seer, seeing the bird struck down in this fashion by the hunter, was filled with pity. Then in the intensity of this feeling of compassion, the Brahmin thought, this is wrong. Hearing the Kranka hen wailing, he uttered these words, since, hunter, you killed one of this pair of Krankas, distracted at the height of passion, you shall not live for very long. Even as he stood watching and spoke in this way, this thought arose in his heart. Stricken with grief for this bird, what is this I have uttered? He's asking what is literature, actually. He being a holy sage, does not say what the fuck have I uttered, but he says, what is this that I have uttered? But upon reflection, that wise and thoughtful man came to a conclusion. Then that bull among sages spoke these words to his disciple, fixed in metrical quarters, each with the same number of syllables, and fit for the accompaniment of stringed and percussion instruments. The utterance that I produced in this volume of grief, which in Sanskrit is shoka, should be called shloka, poetry, and nothing else. But the delighted disciple had memorized that unsurpassed utterance, even as the sage was making it, so that his guru was pleased with him. At last, the sage took the prescribed ritual bath at the bathing spot, and still pondering this matter, went back to his ashram. Then all his disciples chanted that shloka again. Delighted and filled with wonder, they said over and over again, the shloka, grief, that the great seer sang out in 4 metrical quarters, all equal in syllables, has, by virtue of being repeated after him, become shloka, poetry. Now, I think looking at this verse, we can have a double effect as comparatists, thinking back to Heine and Pizarnik. One of the first things it does to me, when I started to think about this comparison of Sanskrit lyric to the Western, is that you realize immediately how Western Heine and Pizarnik both are, how much they are in fact playing the same game. Pizarnik has changed a couple of the rules. I mean, the modern poets have changed a couple of the rules. You don't need fixed meter, you don't need rhyme. But both the Heine and the Pizarnik poem assume an isolated poetic speaker, an interior monologue, an interior reverie. You don't know exactly where you are. In the case of Pizarnik, very, very typical. Are we inside or are we outside? Nova poema da tua sensia, she's addressing someone who presumably is not there, since you are absent. Or on the other hand, maybe you are right there and listening but are spiritually absent, right? We don't actually know where you is. We don't know the gender of the speaker or of the person spoken to. You may be, if Pizarnik's poem is viewed as autobiographical, we may imagine a woman speaking and you are some bastard that she's been involved with. This is a typical Pizarnik scene. But on the other hand, this could be a man speaking to a woman, this could be a lesbian woman speaking to another woman. The you and the I are completely unfixed. Heine's poem does have a fixed speaker, but that's kind of a very metaphorical sort, the Fichtenbaum. And the Fichtenbaum itself steht einsam, right? einsam and also schweigend. So the poetic speech is an interior monologue. The speech is thought rather than spoken, much as in Pizarnik. The Fichtenbaum might possibly have a romantic relationship with the Palma if they could only get together, but they are far away. Rather like Pizarnik and her addressee, just a bitter aftertaste to sketch. This is a dream, a fantasy that we see very ironically. So we have a lyrical speaker, which is an isolated monologue, and then a kind of working through, in both senses to some degree, the form expresses the disjunction. We have in Heine, I suppose, the two stanzas are very important. We get the scene, and then we get the counter scene in the second stanza. And maybe we get a kind of ironic completion whereby the sort of off rhyme, as I think you'd say, in the first line between Höhe and Schnee, becomes a good rhyme, and Morgenland, Felsenwand. So in fantasy, the off rhyme of reality becomes a perfect form. Except the perfect form is ironized, because would this Fichtenbaum actually be happier on the Brennen of Felsenwand? It's not exactly clear, right? The fantasy is very ironic. The fantasy of connection in the Morgenland. A very, and you could, you can do a lot thinking about Heine's own position, what he's doing writing this poem and he's writing, all of that. But you have some kind of working through of the structural irony in the structure of the poem. And I think that Pizarnik is doing something a little bit like that in her 3 lines. In her case, using more of a kind of implicit caesura or pausa in the middle of the 3 lines. If you read them, it falls naturally in the halves. Novel poema e tua sensia, solo un dibujo, un proieto nel muro, alba del vento, un sabor amargo. What you have is in fact a crack down the middle of the poem, right? Which represents, is it the crack in the wall, is it the crack between the speaker and the addressee? I only just thought of this minute, so I blew it completely. What Heine has done between the stanzas, she does down the middle of the stanza. There's a little bit of comparison in action, just invented this minute. But it's sort of, you can sort of see it, right? Now, by contrast, the Ramayana shows how different this is, because the forest is full of trees, right? Unlike Heine's solitary, silent Baum, the Fichtenbaum, not Eichenbaum, the Fichtenbaum, it is a crowded forest. And the forest is full of creatures and is full of people at the same time, right? There are the birds mating. They're apparently actually in the height of passion, the birds are mating. That's what particularly makes it pitiful that the hunter shoots the male bird at that moment. And they're full of people. And the person, Valmiki, is not simply the isolated promeneur solitaire, Rousseau et Bavarie, as it would be, as he might well be in the West. Wordsworth, recollecting in tranquility back home alone in his study in London, how typical the Western lyric poet will be just walking silently, or even back home after the walk, right? Here he is in the midst of it, and at the moment he is speaking, his disciple next to him has memorized it. And it is the fact that his disciple memorizes it that makes it poetry, makes his guru delighted with him. It's a scene of instruction, a scene of transmission, right? It's a collective scene. And immediately it has to go and be spoken to the whole ashram. And this last stanza, the shoka grief that the great seer sang out has, by virtue of being repeated after him, become poetry. Right? It is a repetition of the social group. And if you look at Sanskrit poetry more generally, including, if you do like me, just in translation, it's a very crowded scene. The poems do not tend to assume a solitary reverie, an interior monologue. They tend to be spoken to someone else, not only in Sanskrit, but in the Indian vernacular poems very typically as well. And also there's usually a lot of people around hearing. This is very typical of this scene. So from this we can say already, I think that as a comparatist, the comparison outside the system, even in translation, serves a valuable function to clarify what's going on in the system broadly speaking. Here, let's say the European literary system of which Pizarnik is certainly an heir. That difference is there, that diversity that Christian Moser was just emphasizing, we as comparatists always want to keep in mind. Even with the globalization, it brings us translations of the Ramayana as well as Pizarnik as well as Heine. And at the same time, however, looking further, I think that we can see there is a kind of general unity among all three poems. So if we compare the Waldszene themselves, Heine and the Ramayana, we have, I think, several fundamental features of poetry that Heine and Pizarnik assume that are also not only assumed but actually explicitly commented on already 2,000 years ago in the Ramayana. So with Heine, what makes both of these works, Heine and Pizarnik, read as poetry to us? First, this is language that calls attention to itself by formal devices, and that has a highly rhetorical, artful dimension. Right? These poems are, every word counts for itself. Every word, its metrical system, its sophisticated play against traditional assumptions are there. So just as you could say the works of Goethe are inconceivable without Homer and Shakespeare, so too Pizarnik is inconceivable without the work of Heine and the Spanish and the French and English Romantic traditions that she's playing against. But they both assume artful poetic language, rhetorically rich. These are to be seen first and foremost, metaphorically. We know almost immediately that we're not actually interested in a Fichtenbaum interior life. Its spiritual life is not in itself something we believe in, that this is a talking tree. This is not Tolkien's Ents. This is a metaphor here, right? We know that, just as Great and Muro is already to be seen for its emotional weight, as something about the emotional state of the speaker. It is not just here's a description of a wall, far from it. So it is artful and is transferable. It is transferred symbolically from the moment of inception and understanding to we understand it, I think, in terms of the poet's response to this. So Pizarnik, the speaker's persona, is certainly bound up in reflecting on the relationship. We certainly immediately start to think about Heine, why is he writing this? And we ourselves are supposed to think, let's say if we are in a northern European or North America country with a fantasy of the warm south, and here it has been sort of played with that way. So we immediately transfer. So it is artful language, it calls attention to itself. It transfers from the immediate scene through the poet to us, right? For our personal significance, we will now think of how this relates to our longings for those relationships, whether it is a romantic relationship in the Pizarnik poem or a kind of cultural, geographical position, also coded rather romantically between the Fichtenbaum and the Palama. And finally, these scenes reach us because they are transmitted through expectations. A literary institution has brought them to us. We get them in anthologies of literature. We teach them in school. We only know about Heine and Pizarnik, neither of whom is still alive, because they have been transmitted. And they are already written within institutions of particularly what Dieter Langen has worked on so much, Gattungsformung. We know what a lyric is or should be. Even with Pizarnik, we know what a modernist deconstruction of a 19th century lyric should be. It fits within those expectations for us. Now, these fundamental features of what makes them literary for us, the artful, self-conscious language, the transferability from that scene to us, and the institutional transferability on from the poetic moment, the reception, to us later on, are all explicitly shown in the Ramayana as well, right? 2,200 years ago. So Valmiki's poem is not the same as the cry of the Kranka bird. The hen whose mate has been murdered has a formless cry. And this is already making a particular point. That is a literal thing. Of course, often in poetry, including in Sanskrit as in Middle High German, the poet as a songbird is often the bird song is an image of art, of the naturalness of the poet, right? I mean, Walter van der Vogelweide is already playing on that idea of the Nachtigall, right? As you have also in Aztec poetry, the same metaphor is used. Flowers and bird song are what poets produce. Here, Valmiki, or the poet who tells the story of Valmiki, symbolizes the bird at one level in order to make it just a pure bird cry. It is not art. It is a mere unmediated expression of grief. A wail is not artistically shaped. Whereas Valmiki's response is fixed in metrical quarters, suitable to the accompaniment of stringed and percussion instruments, right? Each with the same number of syllables. That's the difference between her cry and his. On the purely linguistic level, it becomes poetry by the things that would make it rather similar to Heine, right? Even metrical syllables, suitable to the accompaniment of instruments. If you think particularly of the sort of song tradition of Heine's era, Goethe's poems, Schubert could set them to music, that kind of thing. Valmiki would understand that. So as artful language, it is also transferable in that it has been transferred from the initial experience of the Kranke bird to Valmiki, and then immediately to his disciple. If it was just Valmiki, Valmiki's already transferred it, and then reflecting upon it, so it again is self-conscious and is shown to be self-aware, and he's already transferred it. Through, you notice, and this is very significant, and maybe here we could talk about difference as well as similarity, it is the intensity of this feeling of compassion that causes poetry to well up, right? So he's not recollectioning image, it's not like in Wordsworth, emotion recollected in tranquility. It is emotion given artistic form under the pressure of compassion. Now compassion is important because the bird feels passion, Valmiki feels compassion. And that's the difference between mere experience and art. It is one stage removed so that you can shape it. The bird can't, pause to make metrical syllables and make something artistic. Maybe she could, a Wordsworthian bird would recollect in tranquility the death of her mate, and then do a nice little Lucy poem, rolled rocks and earth diurnal chorus for rocks and stones and trees. That may be the Kranke bird. But here, Valmiki is a step removed, but also has an ethical connection to the bird. He is a guru. It is a religious circumstance. Poetry is a religious experience. It is not a secular experience of ironic distance, as perhaps is emphasized both in Heine and in Pizarnik. It is a religious experience of intense ethical connection. And that mixture of distance and connection is what makes possible Valmiki's shaping of the poem. And then the chanting of it by the delighted disciple, so that his guru was pleased with him, creates a social network nexus, which is both, and his pleasure, I think, is both aesthetic and also spiritual. This is a good student. The student has memorized immediately what the professor taught. This is every professor's fantasy, incidentally. So if Heine's fir tree dreams of being a palm tree, the professor dreams of having a student who will immediately memorize everything we say and chant it right back to us. This was not the irony of Borgian reproduction. This is long before that seemed like a bad thing. This is going back to this is now a text that's written. This assumes a cultural world which is primarily oral and not written, in which things are transmitted orally, in which, for example, the Vedas are chanted unchanged, supposedly for 3 millennia, and that you learn by memorizing from sitting at the feet of your guru. You memorize in a group, and that's how you learn, which is still how the Quran is memorized today by students in madrasas. So you have, and then you have, so this transference immediately moves into institutionalization, because the poem, however perfectly composed by Valmiki, would be forgotten with his death, except that now the entire ashram has learned it, has chanted it, and carries it forward. Now this is all explicit within, this is really explicit within the poem. This is being shown. At an implicit level, the poet himself, who is not Valmiki really, because Valmiki is a character, the poet is doing this even more at a meta level. So the poet has chosen the Kranke bird, for example. It's not a random bird. Valmiki sees a random bird, but the poet has chosen that bird for Valmiki to see, right? And the Kranke bird, in English we call it a curlew. I don't know what that's called in German. It's a small wading bird that found along the seashore or waterfront, the curlew, and it has a haunting, warbling cry. So it's chosen, it's sort of like a nightingale in that it's got a particularly beautiful cry. So it's a very poetic bird, and it is a bird that is loyal to its mate. In Sanskrit, they like birds that stick together like this. Geese and swans and crowncuts are very nice because they're loyal mates also. So there's an ethical model for people. So the bird has been chosen carefully. And we have also a kind of a nice choice in the translation that I have here given to keep Kranka untranslated. Now you could translate Kranka as curlew, but the problem is that for an English-speaking audience, a curlew, at least in America, is a shrimpy little bird that just goes cheep, 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 like this. It wouldn't give the right effect. So the translator has intelligently chosen to keep the Sanskrit words, so we have a sense of a bird. Now we lose something because we don't know what that sound should be. But of course, on your smartphone, you can have an app in which you can then hear the song of the Kranka. At least you need the Sanskrit version of that app. I have an English version that doesn't know it until it's Kranka. You can hear various bird cries. We have a further challenge as comparatists to keep alive that sense of distance, but then also, it wouldn't be impossible to translate it to various birds, whether a nightingale, that would have something the same poetic effect here. And then there are, and then actually let me just give you the sequel to this, which is really interesting. Valmiki still doesn't understand what he's done. He ponders it after his class is over. He's still thinking about it. And then he has a vision in which the great creator god Brahma appears to him and asks him what he's thinking about. And Valmiki chants the shloka to him and says, I came up with this, I don't know what to make of it. And here, with a smile, Brahma spoke to the bull among sages. This is a shloka that you have composed. You need not be perplexed about this. Brahman, it was by my will alone that you produced this elegant speech. Greatest of seers, you must now compose the entire history of Rama. And this is the prologue to the Ramayana. So in the prologue, he's been commissioned to write the poem, right? You must tell the story, the god goes on, of the righteous, virtuous, wise, and steadfast Rama, just as you heard it from Narada, the full story, public and private, of that wise man. For all that befell wise Rama, Samitri, the Rakshas, and Vadi, whether in public or private, will be revealed to you, even those events of which you are ignorant. No utterance of yours in this poem shall be false. Now compose the holy story of Rama, fashioned in shlokas to delight the heart. Now this is a very complex little utterance that the god gives in commissioning the poet. In one sense, we immediately see we're in a very foreign, archaic world, quite closely connected as the world of the Homeric epics, you could say, in which the poet is a kind of rhapsode, inspired by the muse who instructs the poet in things the poet doesn't even need to know about, right? Here, Valmiki won't even know some of these events, but now he's going to be able to compose poems about what he has never experienced or even heard about, much like, the beginning of the Homeric epics. That's why they invoke the goddess, right? Calliope, Andra, Enipimusa, Palutrapan, right? Speak to me of that man, or Meninaide Thea Peledeos Achilleos, sing to me, goddess, because I don't even have to know it. I'm the rhapsode, it'll come through me. Valmiki is in that very much same ancient epic world like that, very different from us. On the other hand, so we see something of the varieties of now literary transmission, and this religious context is fundamental to these early texts, much more optional or unusual in the modern poetry. At the same time, we can also understand very readily, even from this episode, that the poet is making a certain series of claims for his text, probably against rival versions of the Ramayana, against people who are skeptical of his own authority to create this version of the Ramayana. So he has the god telling us that no utterance of yours in this poem shall be false. And this is also a trope that you see in a number of ancient texts. The god reveals and says, dictate this down word for word. And you have this also in ancient Mesopotamian literature, for example, in the poem of Era at Ishum, in which the god, that's an interesting case from about 800 BCE, in which a known author, the actual author, Comparative Marduk, says that God revealed this to me and says, now memorize this and repeat it just after me. And this is a true story. And this is a story of how the god of pestilence overtakes Babylon when Marduk is out of town, the patron god. And Kaptialani Marduk, the poet, is a priest of Marduk. And one of the things he's doing is explaining why it was not the priesthood's fault that Marduk's own temple was destroyed in the civil war, that Marduk was not angry at his priests, you see. And this way, the god has revealed this poem to Marduk and says, give it word by word. So Marduk is not making up this justification. And so I read this episode with Valmiki, 400 years away. It's not, they don't know each other's work, but we're in a broad cultural context of assumptions of how poetry is created, which are then used by the poet to ground and give their own poetic authority a divine warrant. Not so different from when John in Book of Revelation is told to eat the scroll. Right? It's given to him, and he's got to memorize it. So we have, in that sense, the beginnings of poetic institutionalization in a religious and ritual context, which will then be secularized in the modern period, and we can go from that to talk about how Haina or Pizarnik herself will ground their poetic authority, and how much, it's interesting, this goes back to Peter Lamping's interest in Bildliteratur in the Goethean sense as this network of authorial relations and presentations, how often that authorization of the poem is done by the Vermittler who will ground the poet's authority both biographically, poetologically, traditionally. These stories about the poet become very important, even in the world of which perhaps the author is supposed to have died long since. So that's the first part of my talk, in which I want to claim that globalization is a tremendous opportunity for us to understand much more seriously the Allgemein in the Allgemeine Literaturwissenschaft. That what was for a generation or two, I think, this tension between the very regional comparative study of Western Europe and the Allgemeine Literaturwissenschaft, that sort of ungrounded universals. I think globalization actually challenges us by putting together examples like this to reground the specificity of what are in fact quite general patterns, you can say. All these poems show artful language, they show symbolic transfer, they show institutionalization, but then as soon as you start to look at that, you then see also the difference across time and space. So we get a broader sense under globalization, not only of contemporary literature, but also of literature going quite far back. I mean, I myself sometimes say I work in a rather narrow band of literary texts between about the year 1900 and 2005. It's just 1900 BC and the more recent 2005. That's what I can think of modern literature, basically. Starts about the 8th century BCE. This is different from, I recently learned from my teenage daughter, Eva, that for her the word modern a few years ago meant since 1995. This is the Vergangenheitsvergessen that we have to worry about, right? If for our students, all of us work in pre-modern literature, if it's older than 1995, we need to connect that pre-modern to the modern, as with Valmiki. So that's the first of my two parts. This is the sort of post-Mozo part, and then I come to the post-Lamping part of the talk. Post in the sense of simply following on to sort of give a couple of further examples of what they've been raising for us. And I wanted to think here about the issue of then what is the role of the national and comparative literature in the global age also, and the nature of comparison as it's seen across nations. And here, just to complement Dieter Lamping's Thomas Mann anecdote, I have a Dylan Thomas anecdote. So I can't verify even the truth of this anecdote or the Thomas Mann one, but like all anecdotes, they're even better. It hardly matters. But this one is translated by the person, or transmitted by the person who experienced it. So Dylan Thomas, late in life, in one of his alcohol-soaked visits, reading his poems in the United States, came to Harvard, where Harry Levin was then an assistant professor of comparative literature and was introduced to Dylan Thomas as a professor of comparative literature. And Dylan Thomas had not heard of this fach before. He said, "Comparative literature? What do you compare it to? Shit!" So the question of what is comparison was already raised, but at least that's what I believe he said. Harry Levin has reported this anecdote, but couldn't bring himself to say the final word of the question, so one has to imagine it was that or some equivalent, but if it had been less outrageous, he probably would have said what it was. So probably that is what Dylan Thomas said to Harry Levin, not understanding what comparison is. And this question of the national, and I very much want to go back to this, and I want to say that the national, I think, still has a very important and really critical role for us as students of literature, but not, and for many of the same reasons that both of the previous speakers have said, not if we understand still the fiction that there is a national literature in the national language. You think how few cases there are where there's a one-to-one correspondence between a geographical boundary and a language to begin with. I mean, Iceland, Japan, to more or less of an extent, but you know, certainly not German, certainly not English, but very few languages, you know. And conversely, very few countries have only one language. I mean, what is Romanian literature? You certainly have to talk about several different languages to talk about just a not very large country like Romania. But yet, very much as Professor Echo was saying, it is really the literary scholars who preserved this fiction of the national literature much longer than most authors have done. And we tend to systematically exclude works from our literary studies that are not in the so-called national language. There are many examples of this. For example, I edited an anthology of British literature some while back. We have a lot of pages devoted to John Milton, but we have none of his Latin poetry. In fact, no British anthology I know of has ever had Milton's Latin poetry. Why not? He valued his Latin poetry very highly. He wrote it fluently, but it was not in the national language. And we know that poetry is not as interesting, even though we've never read it, because it's not in Latin, it's not in English, right? And the same thing you'll find in anthologies of Korean literature. Highly nationalistic 20th century anthologies very often include nothing written in Sino-Korean, let alone in Chinese. But the Korean intellectuals until the 20th century largely wrote either in Chinese or in Korean using the adapted Chinese alphabet, the Sino-Korean. That's about 2/3 of the surviving literature from Korea before the 20th century. And the anthologies leave it out because they only want what's written in the modern Korean alphabet, originally invented by a commission by King Sejong 500 years ago, but it was only slowly adopted by the intellectuals. So whether in British studies or in Korean, the national language has taken hold, and things get excluded even if they're written there. And I think that let's just give you a couple of interesting examples of this. Actually, to take up Vladimir Nabokov, example that David Lamping was mentioning, he does get counted as an American author because he switched to writing in the national language when he moved to the United States. But many other writers do not. I put into the British anthology Marie de France, and I believe this was the first time that she ever appeared in an anthology of English literature. Now, she made her whole career in London. She worked on Arthurian themes, on British themes, so in that sense also she's like thematically. But she wrote an Anglo-Norman rather than an Anglo-Saxon, and so she has always been treated as a wholly owned subsidiary of French departments and never seen as part of English literature, even though her very name means Marie from France, right? Marie de France. No French writer working in France would ever have that name. Should have been Marie de Paris, Marie de Lyon, not Marie de France, which would be, Saul Bell of America is not a phrase that you would use. So we put her in our British anthology, arguing that she should be there for exactly the same reason as T.S. Eliot. She migrates there, she makes a career there, she works on themes from there, she is as much a British writer. And what this means is I think we have to think not of national literatures, but of national markets. And this is very much building on Goethe, but not in this sense one step further, because Weltliteratur is not only the Verkehr across these Grenzen, but also then within any national space. What is world literature, I think, exists in a kind of a figure-ground reversal, and very much the idea that world literature is always in the nation. World literature is the large frame within which the national literature exists, but world literature is only read inside the national system. It's what's available to us, it's what is taught, what is translated, what is reviewed, what is seen. And world literature, therefore, has a different shape in each part of the world where it appears. The canon of world literature will vary significantly in China, in Germany, in Poland, in Romania, in the United States, in Argentina. There are overlaps, but there are also significant differences what world literature is in each place. And my major theme with this is that if we think of the national market, we should then realize that everything that is circulating in the country is part of its literature. And this is why it was Tristram Shandy that made me a comparatist, as Martina was saying. I was telling Peter Lamping's story a little more fully yesterday. A teacher gave me a copy of Tristram Shandy when I was like 15. That was the first book I'd read for grown-up people, and I thought it was wonderful. And I wanted to read more like that. And since he speaks of my dear Rabelais and my dear Cervantes, I said, I don't know who those are, but I'll go read them. It was this wonderful sort of naive moment of exploring the world. And I really knew nothing. After I read those novels, which I really liked, I said, oh, I like these satirical, hilarious, fast-paced narratives. What else can I read? So I looked in the back of the Penguin Classics edition where I read this, and I find Divine Comedy. That sounds pretty funny. So I read that. I soon discovered it was not the laugh riot I was expecting. So then I said to myself, okay, well, I really like this serious spiritual stuff. What else can I read that's like really this sort of netherworld and tragic? And so then I looked in the back of the Penguin Classics and I find Gogol, Dead Souls. So I read that and discovered it was a sparkling comedy that I was expecting Dante to have been. So in that sense, these are all then part of American literature at that moment. In the 1960s, included those works in some fundamental sense. Just as for Lawrence Sterne, the literature in his sphere had much more Spanish and French literature than British texts. England was still pretty much in the backwater, and there were more things imported than produced locally. And particularly, I think, in the question of language, we really have to think then that language is not the barrier to the national literature, the national scene as a market. And my example here will be a sort of closing example, Marguerite Yourcenar, whose Mémoire d'Adrien was a bestseller in the 1950s. And she, like Vladimir Nabokov, she emigrated to the United States relatively early in her life and spent most of her working life in the United States. But unlike Nabokov, she never switched from her native language. She kept writing in French. But for 40 years of her life, she's living in the state of Maine, writing. And her best-known novel, Mémoire d'Adrien, was written entirely in the United States. She's lived in America for a dozen years by the time she published the memoir. When she returned to, mostly wrote after 1949, she was an American citizen by that point. So even legally, she was an American author by the time she publishes that. Like Marie de France before her, however, she has been discussed almost entirely by French scholars. I have not found a single article on Yourcenar by an Americanist, because she writes in someone else's national language, even though there she was. But she not only lived with her American lover, Grace Frick, for 40 years, but she traveled widely in the United States, and she praised this expansive breadth to her friends. And she writes to one friend, if I were you, I would start by hitchhiking to San Antonio or San Francisco. It takes time to get to know this great country, at once so spread out and so secret. She collected African-American spirituals in the South, and she published a whole volume of translation, yet another author who translates, published under the title Fleuve Profond sans Rivière. And she translated Henry James's What Maisie Knew into French, and later translated James Baldwin. So she's translating American literature, both black and white American literature, during this whole period. Yet these active relations to American literature and culture go largely undiscussed by her French critics, and even more by the Americanists who don't think of her as an American writer. Yet it is likely that her American experiences enriched her meditations on the far-flung empire of Hadrian. The empire at once so spread out and so secret is nothing like Belgium or even Paris, where she made a career before moving to the United States. And I think that her heroes' bemused tolerance of minority populations like the Jews in Rome, Judea, directly reflect her fascination with blacks in the American South, if one thinks of what she's doing. That landscape, the imperial landscape of the Mediterranean, is actually read out of her experience of the United States, the continent of America. Even her relative disengagement from much of American culture itself can be seen as contributing to Olympian portrayal of the Roman emperor. As Edmund White shrewdly observed in a review of a biography of Yourcenar, her aloofness at Sarah Lawrence College, where she was teaching, sounds remarkably like Vladimir Nabokov's at Cornell. Both Nabokov and Yourcenar, may be noted, were lecturers in comparative literature at their respective colleges in the United States. And in the very years that Nabokov was gathering local color for Lolita at Cornell, Yourcenar was plotting out her universalized portrait of Hadrian in Connecticut and in Maine. Her choice to settle in the United States, she later said, is not that of America against France. It translates a taste for a world stripped of all borders, a kind of Imperium Romanum, alliterate. So it's sort of not a world republic, but about a world imperium, of which she would be the empress, of course. Very, very appropriate. In an afterword to Carnet, to Mémoires d'Adrien, Yourcenar wrote of resuming her long-abandoned novel while on the transcontinental road trip of her own by train in February of 1949. She writes, "Closed inside my compartment as if inside a cubicle of some Egyptian tomb, I worked late into the night between New York and Chicago, then all the next day in a restaurant of a Chicago station, where I waited a train blocked by storms and snow, then again until dawn, alone in the observation car of a Santa Fe Limited, surrounded by black spurs of the Colorado mountains and by the eternal patterns of the stars. Thus are written at a single impulsion the passages on food, love, sleep, and the knowledge of men. I can hardly recall a day spent with more ardor or more lucid nights." Yourcenar was very sensitive to place. She became an environmental activist later in her life, and you could say this is a very localized moment, to take the term of the glocal. She is at once universal and local. She is surrounded by the black spurs of the Rocky Mountains and the eternal patterns of the stars. She is both linked to the landscape and separated from it, alone in the observation car of a Santa Fe Limited train. Not long before Nabokov would work on Lolita while pursuing butterflies in Colorado, she continued to write her novel while touring New Mexico with Grace Frick. Now, the Mémoires d'Adrien entered American literary space directly when it was published in New York in 1954, a couple of years after its French publication. Came out in the translation lovingly prepared in Northeast Harbor, Maine, by her lover Grace Frick, corrected nightly by Yourcenar herself, who prided herself in possessing a better command of English prose style than her American partner. The Mémoires d'Adrien received glowing reviews around the United States and stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 20 weeks, from December 1954 to May of 1955. It was eventually edged off the list by a varied group of American imported novels, including Françoise Sagan's Bonjour Tristesse, Thomas Mann's Confessions of Felix Kroll, and very differently, Max Hyman's No Time for Sergeants. Lolita was in press during those very same months, hit the bestseller list a few months later. It is not unlikely that Nabokov was intrigued by his fellow emigre's portrayal of a philosopher king in love with a handsome young man, Antonius. And the popular success of Hadrian's fictional memoir surely helped pave the way for Nabokov's very next project, the tragic commentary memoir of the deposed Zemlin monarch, Charles X. Kinbote, in Pale Fire. Yet only Nabokov is viewed by Americanists as an American writer. Yourcenar not at all. So my point will be then, building on the two prior talks, that globalization and the opening out of the national means that the globe pours into the nation, both in terms of what writers are doing a long way back, and in terms of what we scholars have available to teach, to read, and to study within the national boundaries. So I think that if we think in terms less of a national literature and more in terms of a national market, then we have more than ever a vital role for comparative literary study today and in the future. Thank you.
excellent speech. And I would like to open the discussion. Are there any questions or comments? Herr Damrosch versteht auch sehr gut Deutsch, also Fragen können auch auf Deutsch formuliert werden. Er wird dann auf Englisch antworten.
How do you consider Jewish literature, for example? So, what are the boundaries? Is it then Russian Jewish or German Jewish literature, for example?
Yes, a very good case. You know, I am very much a both and kind of guy. Maybe it's a Kierkegaardian aspect. If I have an entweder oder, I say die beide, bitte. So that I'm very happy to see Saul Bellow as an American writer, as a Canadian immigrant writer, as a Jewish writer whose first language was Yiddish, as a world writer. And those are at least 4 different ways. And as a masculinist writer, those are 5 different contexts. You can read that novel on all those niveaux, or his novels in all those ways. And in one sense, he becomes a different writer depending on our context for reading him in that way. I sometimes feel that sometimes very sophisticated post-structuralist critics who are very loyal to a national tradition suddenly become essentialists when they say, oh, Marguerite Yourcenar is just a French writer. Can only mean what it meant to her readers in Paris when she was published, right? But in fact, so a Jewish American writer like Bellow can be seen very differently, and this is true of all sorts of productions. Just to build on this Jewish question, there's a nice on the transnational literature. There's a Danish scholar, Mads Rosendahl Thompson. There's a nice book called Mapping World Literature, in which he has a chapter on Holocaust literature as a inherently international form. And that's not only Jewish literature, so you have all kinds of people who write Holocaust literature, Jerzy Kosinski and others. And he points out it was never written within a national context and was always international. So in that sense, Jewish literature is particularly nice if you see it in its full extent, because it is always already international. But the given writer is also a national writer in that context.
I was very intrigued by an idea that you mentioned in the first part of your talk, when you said that there are several overlapping world literatures as seen from specific places in the world. I think that's a very good way of breaking up this monolithic concept of world literature in the singular and pluralizing world literature, overlapping different brands of world literature according to different places in the world where, again, different cultures overlap and determine the way, the perspective on this global phenomenon of literature. Could you expand on this idea?
Yes, it's very practical for me. And partly, you sometimes hear this discussion, particularly brought forward often by very committed post-colonial critics in the United States, that, oh, world literature is an American imperial export through global English of an American multiculturalism to the rest of the world. Gayatri has a couple of depressing paragraphs at the beginning of her Death of a Discipline book, in which she says, oh, these anthologies are coming out now, in which Nigerian students now will read about their literature as presented to them by an American publisher who's given large advances to an American scholar. I just wish I knew what American scholar had gotten those large advances. I'm very envious of those people. But I point out to my friend Gayatri that she's wrong, because the American anthologies of world literature are only sold in the North American market. You can get permission costs are too large to get the world rights. So you can get North American rights for one amount of money for a text, but world rights cost twice as much, and there's not as much market. So the American publishers only publish for the American market the world literature anthologies. Thereby, global capitalism has protected the rest of the world from the American anthologies, except to the extent they're pirated online and so on, which is a whole other feature. But the anthologies are not designed. And it often strikes me as amusing that the critics of world literature often pay no attention to how much work is happening on world literature around the world. So Yuri Talbot has been editing an ambitious series of world literature texts in Estonia for 20 years now. Japanese, there's several different Japanese world literature collections going back decades. In China, there's several different collections going back for decades. So there's world literature is being produced and thought about, and they have a different shape. Right now, I'm just finishing co-editing an anthology, 2 volumes of world literature for the Chinese market, to be published by Beijing University Press, editing with a Chinese friend of mine. And I suppose about 3/4 of the works are the same as in the comparable anthology in the United States. But he wanted more American and French works in than I had thought to put in. And I was also getting him to put in Vietnamese works and Korean works, which had never been in a Chinese anthology of world literature. So we are trying to also push the market. So too often, so the Chinese, with their own kind of great power of centrism, were not paying much attention to the literatures of the minor peripheral countries around them. So he and I both are now getting more East Asian works, non-Chinese works, into the Chinese world literature market, as well as they want more American work than the American audiences do, because American audiences get it elsewhere anyway. So it really takes quite different shapes, even ones that I'm working with. And my footnote to that is that we all have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility, I think, to push against the market. Even if I think in terms of national markets, I don't mean it passively, but we as scholars, reviewers, activists, translators need to be intervening in the market and expanding the market against this own blindness.
Many thanks for the inspiring talk. Many thanks for the Dylan Thomas anecdote. I would like to ask something about your question, the 2 question marks in the title, comparative literature. It sounds a bit like Dylan Thomas, but it also sounds like David Damrosch.
I often sound like David Damrosch.
You made some comparisons in your talk. My question is, do we always have to compare to be comparatists? Could you say something about the role of comparison within comparative literature from your point of view?
That's really a very, very rich question. I'll try to be brief. I think a lot about this. When I was a student in the pre-modern period, as my daughter would say, in the 1970s, comparative literature looked either like my dissertation looked either like my mother's dinner plates or like the Italian flag. You needed something red, something green, and something white on the plate. So you would have 3 national literatures, 3 languages, typically French, German, and one other. English, or it might be Russian, or it might be Golden Age Spanish, rarely Latin American. That was not even in the field. So I think that I'm still quite loyal to that heritage, and I think comparison is a fundamental method that we use, but it is not necessarily across the 3 separate languages. So I feel that we can open up the relation to the national and regional departments and traditions, in that there was this kind of division of labor, which we were also hearing about, I think, elements in both earlier talks, whereby comparatists would compare only across nations as well as language. You would never have a comparative literature dissertation on Kafka and Thomas Mann and a Swiss-German writer, right, and Max Frisch, even though you would have Proust and Kafka and something. But that's equally a comparative project, right? So I think that comparison should be able to open up and should be across national boundaries or linguistic boundaries is fully comparison. Just as we can do a comparative project with Yourcenar and Nabokov, even though they're both in the space of the United States of their writing. And equally with globalization, I did a book a few years ago on the Epic of Gilgamesh, an entire book on one text as it travels across time. So that is not a comparative study. I still do a good deal of comparative work, but also we can just trace the fortunes of one text. You could say you're comparing it to itself, actually. Even within the bounds of a text, it's not one thing. So you look at its transformation, not only in translation, but even how it's getting read differently in the ancient Near East already, how the Assyrians are using it different from how the Sumerians were using the earlier poems, and we actually have enough evidence that we can trace that. So, we can talk about it in comparison to itself as it crosses borders in one, in that case even two languages, but still within one Mesopotamian era, and then how it comes into the modern age. That's very much a work of a comparative study of the global age that no longer requires it to be those three different literatures and three different cultures. But I still think the comparison is fundamental to what we do, and probably remains, and I think also, our attention to multiple languages is an important both intellectual and ethical responsibility that we have to this day.